The Soviet assault against German positions along the Oder and Neisse rivers began on the morning of April 16th, in accordance with the plan that Zhukov and Konev had presented to Stalin on March 30th. Nearly 1 million troops from Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, supported by 1,800 tanks and 6,000 artillery pieces, launched the attack. The Soviets outnumbered their German enemy by a ratio of 5.2 to 1 in manpower and 8.2 to 1 in tanks. The largest artillery bombardment in history descended upon the German Ninth Army's front lines, unleashing over 1 million shells. Soon after, Soviet searchlights lit up the night sky to illuminate the battlefield as Red Army troops and tanks began to stumble forward toward the German positions. Zhukov expected a repeat of the rapid gains made during the Vistula-Oder offensive back in January. However, he would not achieve such a swift victory this time. Shortly after midnight on April 16th, Soviet artillery preparation began and intensified in the hour before dawn to an unprecedented scale. Yet most of the shelling fell on previously abandoned German positions, causing little to no damage to the defending forces. Immediately afterward, the Soviet ground assault commenced. Zhukov's troops attacked Frankfurt from the bridgehead south of the city and attempted to cut off its access by pushing northwest. Simultaneously, Lebus and Podolzig also came under attack. The Germans repelled the assault at the first defensive line with minimal losses, while the Soviets suffered heavy casualties. Meanwhile, another heavily contested area was the sector leading to the town of Riesin. The 5th Jaeger Division, positioned northeast of Riesin, held its ground with its right flank bent sharply backward. To the north, the 1st Naval Infantry Division, Kriegsmarine, and the 547th Volksgrenadier Division also resisted the initial Soviet onslaught. In the Frankfurt area, Soviet divisions attempted to cross the Oder under artillery cover and smoke screens, using assault boats, small craft, makeshift rafts, and even logs. Rumors circulated about amphibious tanks being deployed. However, the attempt was brutally repulsed by German artillery, infantry heavy weapons, and light anti-aircraft guns placed along the riverbank. Enemy units that managed to reach the opposite shore were driven back into the water by German counterattacks. Overall, by the evening of April 16th, the results of the first day of the Grand Offensive were not entirely disappointing for the German side, especially when considering the relative weakness of their defenses against the overwhelming Soviet superiority. At the very least, the enemy had failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. General Krebs described the outcome as a major success in defense. However, critical pressure points still persisted along the Seelow Heights and in the Riesin area. Based on reports from frontline observers, Hitler himself ordered, on the afternoon of April 16th, the deployment of the 25th Panzergrenadier Division from the Ninth Army, which until then had been held in reserve, overruling the commands of Army Group Vistula. Heinrici hesitated to comply with the order, as he intended to preserve his armored reserves for a counterattack and was reluctant to commit them to direct frontline support. He repeatedly insisted on saving his panzer units for a decisive counteroffensive rather than employing them in a defensive role. Nonetheless, upon realizing the imminent breakthrough at Riesin and lacking sufficient reinforcements to prevent it, Heinrici requested the deployment of the 25th Panzergrenadier Division and agreed to use it for a local counterattack. He also proposed transferring the 18th Panzergrenadier Division, stationed near Joachimsthal and held in reserve by the OKH, to the Ninth Army. Army Group Vistula's leadership also expressed growing concern over the situation south of Riesin, where the 606th Division, the Berlin Division, and the 9th Fallschirmjäger Division were positioned. Reports from these sectors were unclear and chaotic. The headquarters of the Berlin Division had already fallen into Soviet hands while defending its command post in northeastern Neuhardenberg. The division had fought in numerous skirmishes in the preceding days, and Heinrici doubted how much longer it could hold out. That same day, the Luftwaffe launched 300 aircraft into combat. The German air attack managed to disable several Soviet armored vehicles, losing only 12 aircraft in combat. though 38 more were destroyed while landing at airfields southwest of Berlin, already under attack from the US Air Forces. In the afternoon, German kamikaze pilots attacked Soviet bridges in an attempt to cut off the supply flow across the Oder. Only 8 to 10 aircraft managed to reach their targets, with 2 pilots dying as they crashed into them. Overall, Zhukov's initial artillery bombardment proved ineffective against Heinrici's calculated withdrawal strategy. Moreover, Zhukov had underestimated the drawbacks of using anti-aircraft searchlights to illuminate German positions at dawn. Instead of aiding the assault, the light beams reflected off the smoke and dust raised by artillery fire, blinding Soviet troops and exposing them to German gunfire. Lieutenant General Getman of the 1st Guards Tank Army remarked, "We simply lit up our tanks so the Germans could destroy them." Colonel General Kuznetsov of the 3rd Shock Army acknowledged that the operation had failed due to a predictable strategy that the Germans were able to counter. The meticulous planning of Heinrici proved crucial in withstanding the initial Soviet onslaught. However, in the south, Konev had broken through at the Neisse River and was advancing rapidly toward the rear of the 9th Army. In the days to come, the 9th Army would be forced to make a difficult decision: either retreat westward or risk being completely encircled and annihilated. At dawn on April 17th, new fighting broke out along the entire front of the 9th Army. The Soviets aimed to open a breach west of Kustrin. Increasing numbers of Soviet armored vehicles appeared on the main German defensive line, having cleared paths through the bombarded terrain. These were the vanguard tanks of the 1st and 2nd Guards Tank Armies. The Frankfurt fortress garrison had held its ground against the heavy Soviet assaults coming from the south. North of Frankfurt, German forces still controlled territory along the ridge line stretching to Podolzig. However, between Seelow and Neuhardenberg, it was impossible to determine the exact position of the German line. It appeared that the hastily assembled units, made up of remnants from various divisions deployed in the sector, were barely able to withstand the Soviet attacks. Heinrici waited in vain for the arrival of the 18th Panzer Grenadier Division, which had withdrawn from Joachimsthal and was supposed to join the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division in pushing the enemy back to the Oder Plain. The 25th Panzer Grenadier Division, initially delayed by enemy airstrikes, failed to launch a counterattack near Riesen. The local commander had instead deployed it to defend the hill chain south of Riesen, and along with the 606th Division was holding the area. The 5th Jaeger Division, with a long defensive flank between Riesen and the Oder, was still holding its position on the western bank of the river. By the afternoon of April 17th, alarming news arrived from the southern flank of the 9th Army. Reports indicated that the 4th Panzer Army, which was defending the sector between Guben and Forst, had been cut off. The enemy had broken into the so-called Fortress Triangle of Forst, Cottbus, and Spremberg, which had been intended to protect the 9th Army's right flank. Now, Soviet infantry and tanks were advancing near Cottbus, placing the right flank of the 9th Army in grave danger. The German High Command's daily report stated, "The battle between Frankfurt and Bad Freienwalde has reached its climax. In the midst of fierce fighting, 7 Soviet infantry armies are launching an overwhelming offensive, reinforced by the powerful 1st and 2nd Guards Tank Armies. After a massive artillery bombardment, Soviet forces are advancing along the entire front, but German divisions, resisting with tenacity, are repelling wave after wave in brutal, desperate combat. However, the enemy's numerical and material superiority is beginning to tip the scales in their favor. North of Frankfurt, Soviet forces are pushing back German lines, particularly in the sectors of Seelow and Riesen. A counterattack by the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division attempts to stem the enemy advance in Riesen, but fails under the overwhelming weight of Soviet armor. With no other choice, the division retreats to a defensive position and now faces intense fighting along the Neutreben-Metzdorf-Bliesdorf line. At the heart of the battle, against the 56th Panzer Corps, the enemy broke through German security lines with a massive deployment of tanks, managing to open a dangerous breach. In response, the 18th Panzer Grenadier Division was mobilized and attempted a counterattack in the Gersdorf area. But the reality was stark. The unit arrived exhausted and incapable of launching an effective offensive. Meanwhile, south of Frankfurt, up to 5 Soviet divisions, heavily supported by armor, broke through the defensive line and advanced toward the strategic Melrose-Frankfurt route. In an effort to halt this threat, High Command ordered the deployment of the Nederland Division. All signs indicated that the enemy would launch an even greater assault at dawn, concentrating all its forces on the final objective, breaking through to Berlin. As a result, Army Group Vistula began to mobilize all its reserves in desperation. The 3rd Panzer Army was ordered to release the SS Division Nordland to the west of Seelow. By 1 p.m., Soviet forces had entered Seelow. Despite the Soviet onslaught, the Wehrmacht managed to destroy 106 enemy tanks in a single day. In just 2 days, the 9th Army had reduced a total of 317 armored vehicles to ashes. On the morning of April 18th, the resistance of the 9th Army divisions operating in the Seelow-Neuhardenberg sector collapsed. After 2 days of intense combat, their ability to resist had come to an end. The 18th Panzer Grenadier Division, delayed in its movements, reached the combat zone around noon, just in time to engage the enemy northeast of Müncheberg. There, it confronted the vanguard tanks of the 2nd Guards Tank Army. While it was able to halt their advance, it could not repel them completely. By the evening of April 18th, the defensive situation deteriorated further in the area south of Seelow. The enemy began gaining ground toward Heinrici, and at that time of day, no available forces remained to plug the rapidly widening gap. Although Heinrici had ordered the Nordland and Nederland divisions to move into the area the previous day, they ultimately did not arrive in time. Thus, on the afternoon of April 18th, the 9th Army began to disintegrate south of Müncheberg. The forces located south of the breakthrough point began retreating toward Fürstenwalde. At the same time, the 1st Soviet forces from Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front, coming from the Nysa sector, appeared in the rear of the 9th Army. The German High Command's summary of the day was as follows: "The 3rd day of the great defensive battle on the Oder has begun." Between Frankfurt and Freienwalde, German troops are resisting desperately as the enemy intensifies its offensive. The Soviet tide, supported by massive armored forces, strikes relentlessly, seeking to break through the German lines once and for all. Despite the intense fighting of the previous day, the defenders managed to maintain a continuous front. But the night brought no rest. Under the cover of darkness, the enemy launched fresh assaults, mercilessly punishing troops already exhausted from days of continuous combat. At dawn, the Soviet offensive intensified. The weakened German divisions, now without reserves, faced their ultimate test. In the center of the battle, the situation turned critical. On both sides of Seelow and in the sectors of Neuhardenberg and Rietzen, German lines began to give way. The overwhelming Soviet superiority in tanks, backed by fighters and bombers, opened deep breaches in the front, advancing in multiple directions toward Marxdorf, Müncheberg, and Münchehofe. Faced with imminent collapse, the SS Division Nederland launched a desperate counterattack. In the north, near Rietzen, tank battles raged throughout the day. With tremendous effort, the Germans managed to partially contain the Soviet advance along the Reichenau-Schulzendorf southern Rietzen line. But on the southern flank, the situation was even more dire. 5 Soviet divisions, backed by a tank corps and a cavalry corps, unleashed a devastating assault against the 286th Infantry Division and the southern flank of the Frankfurt fortress. However, German units, putting up fierce resistance, temporarily managed to halt the enemy's advance. The situation forced the German command to make a drastic decision. The forward positions on the Oder bridgehead were evacuated. With no reserves available to reinforce Festung Frankfurt, the retreat became inevitable. Meanwhile, the day's figures reflected the brutality of the battle. According to reports from the 9th Army, 157 Soviet armored vehicles were destroyed, bringing the total to 474 in just 3 days of fighting. But German resources were running dangerously low. With the SS Niederland and Nordland divisions already engaged, Army Group Vistula had no more reserves to commit. In the 56th Panzer Corps sector, the situation was chaotic. The Soviets had penetrated Gerlsdorf and launched attacks from the forests north of Alt-Rosenthal. Despite the efforts of the 18th Panzer Grenadier Division, its counterattack attempts in Wulkow and Alt-Rosenthal collapsed under the weight of the Soviet offensive. The 9th Fallschirmjäger Division, subjected to constant assault, began to fracture. Unable to maintain the cohesion of his troops, General Breuer requested 24 hours to regroup, but Heinrici could not afford the luxury. The fall of Wulkow and Hermersdorf during the afternoon sealed the division's fate. The Soviets now had a clear path to Münchehofe. Attacks continued across all sectors. The Berlin Division and the 606th Division faced another Soviet offensive, led by 60 tanks advancing from the Ringewalde forest. To the southwest and south of Reichenberg, a German counterattack attempted to stop the advance, but the Soviet pressure was unrelenting. The third day of the Battle of the Oder ended with terrifying losses. The increasingly depleted German forces held on with tenacity, but the overwhelming weight of the Red Army was felt in every sector of the front. The defensive line was crumbling, and with every kilometer lost, Berlin stood more exposed. By April 19th, the breakthrough in the 9th Army's sector was widening. The Nordland and Nederland divisions had reached the Berlin-Müncheberg road around midday and were deployed for a counterattack. However, against the combined forces of the Soviet 1st and 2nd Guards tank armies, these two weakened units could do nothing. For the first time since the beginning of the battle, Heinrici requested Hitler's permission to withdraw the 9th Army from the Oder and move it back to the pre-designated defensive line along the Hohenzollern and Finow canals on both sides of Berlin. His request was harshly rejected, and he was told that this was the critical point of the battle, which had to be endured and turned into a victory through the counterattack by the Nederland and Nordland divisions. However, these divisions were unable to repel the Soviets and eventually retreated, along with most German divisions southwest toward Fürstenwalde. Once again, the German High Command's daily report stated the following regarding April 19th. Soviet forces continued their advance, capturing Batzlow and expanding their positions in the vicinity of Riesen. The German units in the sector were overwhelmed and could not contain the offensive. Meanwhile, the 56th Panzer Corps fought fiercely in Müncheberg, where the Soviets attacked with tanks and infantry, supported by artillery and air power, managing to capture several strategic positions. The 11th SS Panzer Corps attempted to re-establish contact with the 56th Panzer Corps, facing Soviet attacks in Marksdorf and Tempelberg, where 60 enemy tanks were destroyed. By the end of April 19th, the tactical situation remained uncertain. The Soviets had reached the Wotan defensive line, and a German withdrawal was recommended to avoid total collapse. However, Heinrici hesitated to order a retreat without Hitler's approval. The 3rd SS Panzer Corps, under the command of Felix Steiner, began receiving direct orders from the Führerbunker, although its limited forces would not be able to carry out the mission it would be assigned in the following days. April 20th marked the end of German resistance in Seelow. General Busse lost communication and control over many of his units, and the fall of the city of Müncheberg gave the Soviets a clear path to advance toward Berlin. The advance on the German capital was led by the 1st Guards Tank Army and Zwickau's 8th Guards Army. In response, Weidling decided to pull back the remnants of his forces southward, attempting to link up with the northern flank of the 9th Army, moving away from Berlin. However, he soon lost contact with the 9th Army for nearly 24 hours, with unpredictable consequences for his corps and the city's defense. Meanwhile, Konev's advance from the southwest alarmed Busse, who sought to withdraw German forces westward to establish a shorter and more manageable defensive line. His goal was to regroup the troops and prepare for a retreat to the west. However, Hitler ordered the Ninth Army to maintain its defense along an extensive 80-kilometer arc centered on Frankfurt, even though the flanks of that line were collapsing under Soviet pressure. Busse understood that the Ninth Army was at risk of being completely encircled between the two Soviet fronts. Every hour that the decision to retreat from the Oder was delayed reduced the chances of stabilizing the front south of Berlin. He believed there was still a chance to successfully fall back to the west, but Heinrici, aware that Hitler forbade any withdrawal without his direct authorization, did not take the initiative at that moment. Throughout the day, Heinrici continued executing his plan to withdraw all combat forces from Berlin. However, this strategy was interrupted when Goebbels removed Reimann, who had held the position of Berlin's defense commander. Finally, with the German defensive line shattered, most of the remnants of the Ninth Army ended up encircled in the Halbe forest, and only a few units of Weidling's 56th Panzer Corps managed to retreat to Berlin. The urban battle for the city began the following day. Would you like to visit the battlefield where this confrontation took place? Do you want to analyze how Heinrici planned his defense in the days leading up to the battle? All the links are in the description.